Marketer of the Day, episode 688. Income, Influence, Innovation, and Impact. Reach a wider audience using active podcasting with Joe Sanok.
Well, hello, Maker of the Day podcast. This is Joe Sanok from the Practice of the Practice podcast. I hope you are doing awesome today. Thank you so much for having me on this show. I'm going to be talking all about podcasting as a way to level up your business in almost any specialty that you have. Now, because you're a listener of podcasts, you probably first feel like everyone's doing a podcast, that I'm late to the game. The stats just don't support that fear. If you look at the actual statistics in regards to a podcast, it is the single best way that you can get your message out there to more people, and it still is not competitive. So first, let's look at some of these stats. So I like to kind of have things that help me visually represent something. And so I looked at the stats on blogs versus YouTube channels versus a podcast that hasn't had a new podcast launch on it in the last 90 days, and then having a podcast launch in the last 90 days. So if we take that first one, if we take that blog and we say, okay, let's give that a size that we can all understand. So say it's a 6 foot tall person. So this 6 foot tall person represents the impact of a blog. So it's going to have a little impact. Now, the difference between that and the impact of a YouTube channel is the difference between a 6 foot tall person and King Kong, who is 110 feet tall. So this is the actual stats and difference that I used here. Now, if we look at the difference between a YouTube channel and just having a podcast, not even having one that has launched anything recently, we're looking at the difference between King Kong and having 7 Titanic ships on top of each other. And I'm not talking the long way. I'm talking from bow to stern, straight up in the air. Now, what about the difference between that and having an active podcast? That is the difference between those Titanic ships and Mount Everest. So when someone asks me, should I just blog? I say no. No, you should start a podcast. You should be on podcasts, because the differences between a 6 foot tall person and the 30,000 foot Mount Everest. Would you rather just be a small person, or would you rather be the Mount Everest in your domain? So there's 5 different things that we really need to think through when it comes to podcasting. First, why you should and shouldn't do a podcast. Second, we want to look at your structures for your podcast. Third, you want to look at your now what of your podcast. Fourth, you want to look at the actual starting of the podcast. And fifth, we want to look at the ongoing marketing of your podcast. Now, a lot of people start with buy this microphone or download this ebook, and then it'll ask you about the title. What do you do? And what are you going to have your description be? But I actually take a different approach. I want you to first determine why you should or shouldn't actually do a podcast. So here's a couple things in regards to why I would say that you shouldn't do a podcast. I'd say if you're already full and you're happy with where you're at, and you don't want to fill up your client base, then I'd say don't do a podcast. That's probably a waste of your time. You probably shouldn't do a podcast if you're just doing it for the fame, because the reality of it is that it actually takes a whole lot of work to do a podcast. It's a lot of time. It's a lot of energy. Now, who should do a podcast? So anyone that wants to attract a larger audience should definitely do a podcast. Also, people that want to branch into new areas should do a podcast. If you want to scale your business or your practice or what you offer, then I'd say do a podcast. And if you want to open doors into new industries and connect with other influencers, then a podcast is absolutely right for you. I often do Q&As with people that think that they shouldn't do a podcast. And I was talking to a real estate agent recently who said, why should I do a podcast? I'm just local. I said, well, then what you should do is you should have a podcast about local things. Have it be about just local industries. Have it be about local businesses, what makes your area awesome to live in. And that person got really excited about that because they're passionate about their area that they live. Or I primarily work with counselors in private practice. A lot of these counselors are like, well, what should I do? Well, is your message bigger than just your area? What are those 5 to 10 things that every client that comes to you asks you about? That's a great opportunity to have a podcast. All right, next we want to look at the structures. Is this going to be an ongoing podcast, or is it going to be a season podcast? So an ongoing podcast is going to post post usually every single week or every single day, or you got to have it be regular. Whereas a season will often launch the entire season at once or over a period of time. And then the host will take a break from that. So there's pros and cons to each of those, but thinking through your structure, is it going to be interview? Is it going to be kind of a season-long story? Are we going to have some Q&A in there, or solo shows? Are we going to do some kind of short episodes? Or are we going to do some deep dives? Is it going to be something that you're investing in or that you're looking into? Is it conversational, or is it more ask the expert? So the structure of a podcast is really important to sort through. A lot of people will have a combination of that. Next, we want to look at planning the now what of your podcast. And so what's that call to action? Is it an email or an e-course? Is it a webinar? Is it that you're testing some ideas and people can kind of bounce them off you? Is it, hey, email me? Is it schedule a 15-minute consult? Or is it scalable to download your software? Figuring out what your now what before you ever start your actual podcast is really important, because it's going to determine how you speak on solo shows, who you interview on your expert shows. And if you're doing kind of live consulting with people, you want to have your ideal client be those guests. So we go through those first 3 steps, and then we're going to look at the actual starting of a podcast, of getting a good quality mic, figuring out your software, looking at your hosting and your structure, and having your guest schedule be an automated sequence so that you're not going back and forth with potential guests to figure out when they can jump on a phone call with you. You want all of that to be fairly automated. But then the real work comes in, is the ongoing marketing of the podcast. So how are you going to market it? How are you going to find bigger names? What is the actual way that you're going to repurpose this, that you're going to invite people, and that it's actually going to increase your bottom line? Now, for most people, they don't sort through why they're doing a podcast. What their call to action is, how it leads into an automated email sequence, which leads into a live webinar, which leads into an e-course, which then leads into being able to make more money. Because we often talk on the Practice of the Practice podcast about building your income, your innovation, your influence, and your impact is exactly where you need to be to really level up. So we have this thing called Podcast Launch School that I would love to introduce you to. It's an e-course coming out in 2020, but we have 27 tips, tricks, and strategies to help you launch your podcast smarter. It's totally free over at podcastlaunchschool.com. Would love for you to go check that out. We also have done for you services. So if you're like, I don't want it all to do any of this other than show up and do the recording, we do all of that also. So you can just go over to practiceofthepractice.com/apply. But I want to give you a couple bonus tips in addition to those 5 that I just gave you. When you're doing a podcast, the biggest thing you can do is to block out the time that you are going to work on that podcast. Not just the time that you're going to be actually doing the interviews and editing it, but that you actually spend time to think through what guests you want, to put together a series of things that you're inspired by so that you can interview people and get into a really awesome flow in your podcast. You also want to be able to optimize your time. So if you do an interview and you record it on something like Zoom, why not repurpose that as a YouTube video, and then repurpose that YouTube video by pulling off the transcript and having that be a blog post and embedding that video in there, and then putting that into your email sequence. See, you want those things that are good quality content to continue to have a life in different platforms. So that video could go on Instagram TV. That video could be uploaded to your Facebook page. There's a lot of different ways that you can repurpose things. So when you think through a podcast, start by thinking about whether you should or shouldn't. And if you say, yeah, I should, what you want to do is you want to think through, how would I know that this is worth my time? Because whatever your business is, if you put an hour into marketing it, an hour into growing and calling potential leads, well, that gives you a very clear ROI in your time. How are you going to know the ROI in your time for doing a podcast? Because podcasts will get you to be that Mount Everest, but you got to do it right. You got to make sure you're optimizing your time. You're not wasting it on learning technology, and you're not wasting it in all these other areas. You learn from people that have already done it. It also gives you an amazing way to reach out to people that you probably have no business talking to. Same thing for me. I interviewed Daniel Pink recently for my podcast. I interviewed some other big names names. But if I didn't have a podcast, I would have no reason to talk to those people. So if you're looking at starting a podcast, again, head on over to podcastlaunchschool.com, and we would love to connect with you more. Thanks so much for having me on the show today.
If you're a future podcaster, new podcaster, existing podcaster, or you're looking to make more money with your podcast with less time, you owe it to yourself to check out doneforyoupodcasting.com. We handle any or all of your podcasting needs. Go to doneforyoupodcasting.com right now.